We're live.
Good morning. I'm going to officially call to order the Friday, April 28th, 2023 meeting of the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. If you would all rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'm going to ask for the certification of a quorum.
Town of Ashland, Mr. Hodges.
Here.
Mr. McGraw. Charles City County, Mr. Atkins.
Bill Cota sitting in.
Thank you. Chesterfield County, Chair Carroll.
Here.
Mr. Winslow. Richland County, Mr. Spoonhour.
Here.
Ms. Lascolette. Hanover County, Mr. Peterson.
Here.
Mr. Davis. Henrico County, Mr. Thornton.
Here.
Ms. O'Bannon. New Kent County, Ms. Page.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Lockwood. Powhatan County, Mr. Byerly. Mr. McClung. City of Richmond, Mayor Stoney.
Here.
Mr. Jones. Virginia House of Delegates, Delegate Robinson. Senate of Virginia, Senator Hashmi. Here. Commonwealth Transportation Board, Mr. Brown.
Here.
Thank you. Capital Region Airport Commission, Mr. Miller. GRTC, Ms. Adams.
Here.
Ms. Torres.
Here.
RMTA, Ms. Dean.
Here.
Thank you. DRPT, Mr. Brule. Mr. Trogdon.
Here.
VDOT, Mr. Britch. Mr. Totten.
Here.
Mr. Riblett.
Here.
Virginia Port Authority, Mr. Edwards. Ms. Vick. And Ms. Nelson.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance, and we do have a quorum.
All right, thank you. I'm going to ask Chet to read a statement relating to the member participation from a remote location. I believe we have Tricia Page, Carlos Brown, William Cota, and Joy Dean that have requested to remotely participate. And their request for this is in the nature of a personal matter, specifically a scheduling conflict that prevents their attendance in person. And I have reviewed their request, and I believe they're appropriate.
And Barbara Nelson as well.
And Barbara Nelson as well.
The action requested is written in the agenda. The motion is to confirm that the chair's decision to approve the member's request to participate from a remote location is in conformance with the CVTA policy for remote participation of members. And the voice of the remotely participating member can be heard by all persons at the primary meeting location. And this can be a voice vote.
Do I have a motion? I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes carried. Thank you. Is there, hopefully everybody's had an opportunity to review the agenda? And if so, I would consider any motions right now, if there are any, to amend the agenda. Not seeing or hearing any motions to amend the agenda will be approved. Next up is the approval of the minutes for the March 31st, 2023 CVTA meeting. Again, the minutes were sent out ahead of time. Hopefully everyone has had an opportunity to review the minutes. And if there is no discussion, I would move on. Motion to approve. Thank you, that's what I was looking for. Do I have a second? I have a motion to approve the minutes from March 31st, 2023 with the proper second. Is there any discussion on the motion or discussion on the minutes?
I'll be abstaining.
You'll be abstaining.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, one abstention. Now we have an open public comment period. This is the time that's allocated within our meeting each month to give anybody from the public who may be here in present or online an opportunity to address the CVTA body. Is there anyone online or in the audience that would like to address the CVTA? Anybody online?
We have not received any requests.
And no requests. Okay, well, not seeing anyone or not hearing anyone online, we will close the public comment period and move on to the chairman's report. I'm going to defer my report until the end of the meeting. It's not much, and it could be something that can be summarized at the very end of the meeting. Next, we have our committee reports. Finance Committee is first up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My report is going to be very simple. I've never accomplished a way to make all these numbers and finance stuff be interesting. But fortunately, I have a lot of good people working with us who can. So I'm going to really defer to them and let them do some of this work. But in our Finance Committee, we dealt with a number of the things that are on today's agenda that we'll be sharing with you. With obviously the financial activities investments report, which Mr. Parsons is going to go over. And we also are going to be looking at, when the TAC speaks to us, they also shared with us some items that we've reviewed through that, but the project selection framework, the advanced funding for CVTA leverage projects, and locality SPA requests. So, but this more is going to be, Ms. Clark is going to be much better equipped to talk about that than I will, so I'll leave that. And Mr. Parsons is going to share the stuff on the financial activities, and it is now in your court, Mr. Parsons.
1 second. Are we going to be showing anything on the monitors as part of this report? Online?
We should, if we, with online people we have.
I would hope so. The only thing I would ask is if we could just turn this one monitor just a little bit towards me, because the glare is making it very difficult to actually see what's on it. All right, hold on, can you all see it over there, okay? Okay, thank you. Mr. Parsons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The financial activities and investment reports are beginning on page 8 in the agenda packet. And you can see that we are showing through March 31st, which reflects the December tax activity. We have a very consistent receipt of taxes for the sales and use tax and also the fuels tax. Year to date, total receipt of taxes is just over $123 million for the authority, with lifetime to date fast approaching $500 million. So that's great news, and we're seeing that consistency is a good thing, and I think we would expect some fluctuation up over the summer as people start to travel more. The distributions transfers to GRTC for the year, just over $18 million for a lifetime to date, just under $70 million. And the regional fund itself, which as you know, the authority is very active in, is just over $162 million for the lifetime of the authority, with just under $43 million for the year. The local distributions are shown on page 8, reflecting a lot of the activity that each member jurisdiction has taken forward. And we are gearing up for the end of year certification of the expenses that have been incurred by each locality, and working with the TAC to make sure that those records are ready for your review at your next meeting. The following page 9, shows the monthly investment report for February with a total book value of just over $151 million. And as you can see at the bottom of the page, the cumulative interest earnings for FY23 are around 1.6 million, which shows that attention that we are all looking for in terms of making sure that available regional funds that aren't tied up in commitment to projects are being reinvested to the positive benefit of the authority. I believe that is the extent of the financial activities update. Mr. Peterson, if you had anything else to add, I'd be happy to refer back to you.
Yes, Mr. Parsons, I think we should point out is on these financial investments, we did speak to that in Finance Committee, realizing that our return on investment was basically just barely over 1%. But we were informed and they put it that a lot of the reason we are not getting the same return in private sector is because of government regulations as to how it can properly be invested. I think a lot of us were concerned, I guess those that's in the private sector said, that's not a real good return, but apparently from what I'm understanding, that is probably a reasonable return for a government entity.
Thank you, sir. Next.
Yes, sir. Item BC, dealing with the financial policies and procedures. Finance Committee had a great discussion and conversation with our consultants, PFM, and Ms. Choi is here to provide an update to the authority in person. And then we're prepared to talk about a possible recommendation for discussion.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
you just indulge me for a moment. When I was in the honor of being chair, I read a statement, and it went something like this: you can't build a great building on a weak foundation. You must have a solid foundation if you're going to have a strong superstructure. And I use that quote since the last meeting of the financial report that we had. And I want us to kind of take a look at the information that we're receiving. And I don't want to be like the general in the Civil War, McClellan, who was too cautious, but I do think we need to, as we are starting out, this is our third year, I believe, let's make sure we're putting things in the right place. And all of our data that we're receiving is the best data for the CVTA. I bring this issue up because I think with the financial group that we had last time, very respectful of the information that was shared by them. And they had several suggestions and recommendations for us. But after further reflection on my part and others, there were some references to some of the information from the financial group toward Northern Virginia, and I think it was on reference to Hampton Roads. My point is this: I think that each authority is different and unique. And each authority then, we need to look at it as being customized. So the data that we receive, we need to look at it very carefully. So just because maybe Northern Virginia does something or Hampton Roads does something, that doesn't mean it is the best for us, the CVTA, to do that. So I'm just reminding the commissioners, let's take a look at the data that's shared with us. And I'm thinking also that we also had another group that we use from time to time to go over that data. And these are persons like, I forgot the name of the group, but they kind of look over information, glean it for us, and give us also additional information. So I am suggesting that since the last financial meeting that we had and the report this morning, that the Finance Committee take another look at some of those items that have been discussed and will be discussed, and then come back to us with some improved or maybe some data that they have studied and can suggest things. I'm just a little sensitive to when we have reports like this, is it the best for CVTA? And I know we have to use other groups, maybe as a barometer, but there's only one CVTA, and we only in our third year. And we want to make sure that we have stability and we have sustainability. And also, in conclusion, one of the concerns we had, I think, or challenges, which was a good thing, is we had the sensitivity of smaller localities. And I'm thinking, as you look at how the money has been apportioned, small localities have come out reasonably well. So my whole point is, let us take another look at direction we're going with the financial data and see is the most efficacious way for this CVTA to handle.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
if I could just add to Mr. Thornton's question, I believe with the things were brought today from the Finance Committee were brought for discussion.
Yes.
I don't think we brought anything with the intent of making a decision today. But I think with the Finance Committee wanted to get the input and from their full board, full members. So, as such, I anticipate much of this going back to the Finance Committee with the additional input from fellow colleagues here on this commission.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Yeah, we didn't have all members present in the Finance Committee meeting when we looked at this. We wanted to move it forward to the full committee and make sure we had this information out there to get input, and then we'll see where it goes from there. We ready?
All right, thank you. Good morning. My name is Christy, and I'm from PFM, Financial Advisor to the Authority, and I'm here this morning to speak to elements of debt and reserve policies as an informational item, as we have taken a look and reviewed the Authority's existing financial policies. So on slide 3, I wanted to first acknowledge that the Authority already has a written and adopted financial policies that were adopted back in February of 2021, which is reflective of the Authority's objectives and its mission of funding regional projects. It's already embedded as part of the CVTA's financial management culture. And what that document covers is it establishes the Authority's roles and responsibilities. It establishes framework for strong internal controls and ensure proper financial management and review. So most of what's already covered in that document as it stands are pertaining to the management responsibilities of the Authority. What that document does not currently include are any metrics that pertaining to debt. And I think all of us would agree that inclusion of some level of debt policies is best financial management practice, and a lot of the member jurisdictions have one already. The debt policies ensure long-term affordability of debt, and it also, when it comes time for CVTA and when there's a decision that's made that you all would like to leverage your 35% regional revenues, and we're talking to the credit agencies, debt policies also, strong debt policies support high credit ratings. So we have taken a look at the policies and we've made some recommendations to include in the existing policies a set of metric that governs debt service coverage and a metric that looks at working capital reserve as a requirement. So taking a look at the debt service coverage first, and I wanted to start by explaining what that metric is. It's an industry standard ratio that's used to look at the debt affordability of an entity. So it has in the numerator revenues and in the denominator debt service obligation. You divide that by each other, and then you end up with this metric. So in the example you see sort of at the bottom of the page there has 70 million as a numerator, 35 million as a denominator, which results in a 2 times debt service coverage metric. All else being equal, higher coverage results in a higher credit rating. So what we have recommended here is a set of, a metric for your consideration is for CVTA, when looking at the debt service coverage metric, the first point is to perhaps take a look at a smaller universe of revenues within the 35% regional revenues to pledge to the bonds. So the authority currently receives sales and fuels tax revenues, and our recommendation is to just look at sales tax revenues in the numerator for the purposes of paying debt service. Now that's still, the fuels tax revenues will still be available, but they can be used for pay-go projects as an example, and any leveraging or any metric that pertain to debt would be looking at sales tax revenues only. And really our thinking here is twofold. One is that it provides for a more conservative approach when it comes to debt, so that you're only looking at, you're always preserving a portion of your revenue stream to cash funded projects. But also, I think more importantly, there is a lot of noise and uncertainty pertaining to the fuels tax revenues as generally a dedicated revenue source for debt service and in the investor community, where the future of fuels tax is a little bit uncertain, given the electric vehicles and everything else that's happening in our industry or in our general, lifestyle. So I think both investors and credit rating agencies have a more skeptical view when it comes to fuels tax revenues generally as a revenue source. So our recommendation is let's just strip that out of when it comes to calculating debt-related metrics and use it solely for cash-funded projects. In terms of the level, we recommend a 2 times minimum coverage requirement, and I think this is a starting point of a discussion. We're starting at 2 times because, to me, setting the right level is a balancing act of making sure that CVTA has enough capacity to generate debt funding, capacity to fund larger projects, but also we don't want to leverage our revenues down too far down so that we are we're exposed. So it's a balancing act of making sure that there's sufficient capacity, but also conservatism. I think 2 combined is important. And we started at a 2 times coverage requirement, looking at the rating agency criteria of how the agencies analyze sales tax revenue debt, but also looking at some of the other entities in the region. So on slide 7, the 2 times coverage metric for CVTA and using sales tax revenues as the sole pledge, the authority, we believe, will be likely rated in the AA category. And also, to give you a sense of magnitude, that 2 times coverage ratio generates about $300 million in debt capacity. I'm certainly not here today recommending that CVTA leverages the full $300 million anytime soon, but this number is just here to give you a sense as to what the 2 times coverage metric would generate if we were to maximize to its full potential. You can see that some of the other entities, Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, I-81, had a 2 times coverage metric as a guideline. However, I will say that this is sort of a policy minimum requirement. And if you were to look at each entity and how their coverage performance are currently, they're all over the place. So like in the case of NVTA, I can tell you that they're generating something like 60 times coverage against a 2 times leverage, because they've only issued 1 bond issue since its inception in 2014. Hampton Roads, on the other hand, is almost fully leveraged, all the way very close to its minimum requirement, and I-81 is somewhere in the middle. So while these 3 entities share the same sort of minimum requirement, if you will, the way they have decided to leverage and how much of it and using which different types of debt have all varied across the board. So moving on to the reserve discussion. The working capital reserve is some money set aside to help achieve financial stability and flexibility and provide a cushion against unexpected events. And I wanted to acknowledge that authority in its regional project selection and allocation framework, which I know is next on the agenda. There is already a general programming methodology that allocates only a certain targeted percentage of funds of projects to cover cost increases and allow for project selection in the future. And the reason why I bring this up is because I just wanted to make sure that, the thinking behind the working capital reserve is identical to this programming methodology that's in the framework, because PFM views that methodology more as a programming guidance or a practice as opposed to reserve. It's not necessarily dollars set aside every year going into a certain bucket, but it's more of a, for planning purposes, you all are making the decision to allocate only a certain percentage of it, and whether that actually ends up in the bottom line or if it gets repurposed the following year is all up to you all. So when I talk about the working capital reserve, I'm thinking about funds set aside in a separate bucket that is only used for certain circumstances. So on slide 9, CVTA in its profile of the organization, is a regional planning organization, and that's providing funding opportunities and not necessarily constructing projects. So I think the primary purpose of this reserve would be to help manage CVTA and any cash flow mismatches. So an example may be that, revenues that come in the door are actually not, are less than what you had projected. Or it could be that, requests for disbursement requests under the standard project agreements are coming in sooner than what you had anticipated, creating, more needs than the actual revenues coming in the door that, may occur. Which I think, this scenario is probably something that the authority would not have to worry about in the near term, given that I think project expenditures are now just about to start to occur. So I think that concern about the cash flow mismatch is likely something that is kind of further down the road, if you will. But I think when we think about financial policies, it's something that should fit in the long term and should fit within not just now, but also work for years down the road. So I think the working capital reserve in that context is sort of looking out further in the future of what might happen and what CVTA may need down the road. So the financial policies that the authority already has actually state and refer to funding or maintaining a working capital reserve in an amount determined by the CVTA Finance Committee. So it already has a reference to this concept of working capital reserve. It just does not define how much it is or what it is. So our recommendation is to initially set an amount of the working capital reserve equal to 3 months of the CVTA's regional CVTA funds. That's about 17 million. But I think the most important part of this policy is that we should reevaluate whether that is the right level once project expenditures start to occur. And the standard project agreements come in the door at some point down the road. And I sort of picked June 30, 2025 as a good starting place, thinking that by that point that we would have a good amount of data to review, to evaluate CVTA's expenditure cash flows, because what we have right now is a solid set of inflows, revenues coming in the door on a monthly basis. And so we have data to look at the volatility of revenues coming in the door. We just don't have that other piece of the data of revenues going out the door to, I think, really look at this policy holistically. So I think in a couple of years, we should have a good set of data on expenditure schedules that we can evaluate to think about whether, this cash flow mismatch, how we should think about that, how much is really needed once we're up and running in terms of making these expenditure requests, disbursements a couple of years down the road. So on the last slide, I wanted to leave with some thoughts on how CVTA might first fund up this working capital reserve if this was the direction that the authority wanted to head into, of that 17 million 3 months requirement that I just cited. And I think there's a few things. One is there's investment earnings, as Mr. Parsons just mentioned, that is that is earning and performing well, which is not allocated. And I think that just in the last 6 months was around 2 million. So that's certainly a source of revenues that hasn't been allocated that I think could be considered to initially seed the money into the working capital reserve. There is also, the authority's budgeted figure for regional revenues is very conservative for this fiscal year. So if in actuality, revenues were to perform similar to last year, for example, there would be around $4.5 million that's available that would likely fall to the bottom line. That's also unaccounted for. So I think there are some sources that exist that are unallocated that the authority can consider initially depositing into the working capital reserve. And of course, lastly, if and when the authority decides to move ahead with the debt issuance, we could also look at, and at that point, if the working capital reserve is not fully funded, we could basically look at, funding another project that you might have identified as a cash funded project and issue debt and do a little swap and use that cash flow to fund up the working capital reserve. So those were just some ideas, some initial ideas that I had and how we might be able to fund this reserve requirement. So I think that brings to the end of my presentation, and I'd certainly be happy to address any questions you may have.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Joy, we had the same presentation, obviously, in the Finance Committee, but since that time, I've had some discussions with the finance folks in Hanover County. Hanover County, we have a AAA bond rating, so we're pretty proud of that. And but this may be just a difference in the types of organizations, but my understanding, like in Hanover County, we our debt service, we limited basically 10% of our general expenditures. That's that's like 10
Right.
rather than 2.
Right.
And that's, of course, kept us in the right place. They're pretty far apart. Is that? Can you give me some feedback, some understanding as to why the wide variation between the 2 times versus
Absolutely.
what we're doing? And I don't understand. I'm not in the financial field. That's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, no. I think that is a great question. And just to put it in context, it is very different, right? Because the 10%, that 10% is a debt service as a percent of either general fund revenues or expenditures. And if I were to convert this 2 times coverage into the similar kind of metric, it would be 50%. Because the 2 times essentially mean that the authority can spend up to 50% of its regional revenues or sales tax portion of the regional revenues to debt service, which is, a pretty big difference. And I think the biggest difference is between Hanover County and CVTA and how these, not just the other regional transportation entities, but these types of sales tax revenue bonds or any revenue bonds, versus a general obligation bond. I think the biggest difference really is that the limited purpose of the entity and the type of projects that it can spend money on. So, right, Hanover County has a gazillion different types of projects that you all need to fund within your general fund budget. And the CVTA, the purpose of CVTA is to fund regional transportation projects, if just on the regional revenues, I'm speaking on the 35%. So I think that that's much narrower of a scope of an organization, of its mission compared to Hanover County. And I think that that's evident in most other, revenue pledge bond transactions that you look at. I mean, VDOT's I-81 project and that legal framework, that's supposed to cover just one project, I-81. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar project, but that's one project. So I think that for the most part, it's the way that it's really the nature and the limited purpose of what the funds could be used for. I think is the biggest distinction when I think about those two entities.
Hi, Adam. Another thing that gets that ratio closer is if you added back in the local tax, the fuels tax. So that ratio is actually greater than a 2-to-1, probably more like a 4 or 5-to-1 when we add those revenues back, and then we're not even considering, which, or which also has a triple.
Mr. Thorne?
Would you say then, this is hypothetical though, what you're suggesting in your report, to go to 10%. So would you say though, that if you stayed at 5%, that it would be deleterious to the CVTA rather than going to twice that?
If we were to make our coverage, our debt service coverage requirement a more conservative amount, which would be that a higher coverage requirement. So if we were to go from a 2 times to 4 times maybe, which will essentially put the CVTA in less leveraging power, if you will. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the trade-off here is between, the higher, the more conservative you are on the coverage policy, the less leveraging you could take on in the future. So, I had preliminarily calculated a $300 million of debt capacity using 2 times leveraging amount. If that were a 4 times, that would look more like $150 million leveraging capacity. So I think, but then what that would do on the other side is it would put more money to the bottom line for you to be able to do more cash funded projects. But the cash funded projects can only occur within the limitation of that particular year's cash flow availability, right? So I think it's just a trade-off between, are there certain large, big scale projects the CVTA might want to fund upfront and not necessarily have to wait for 5-10 years to accumulate the funds to be able to afford that project? Or, do we go to that route? Do we just wait? Do we just program what is remain as pay as you go only, and wait until the dollars accumulate, and when the authority has a cash flow to be able to do the projects, wait to do that? I think that's ultimately where the decision, the trade-off between the two options.
Mr. Barris?
We are, right now, I would say we're at uncertain economic times. Some say there's a recession around the corner, but we've been saying that for a couple of years now. And I just wanted to get your opinion on how would we account for economic disruptions? How volatile the sales tax could be, that revenue stream. And so moving forward, how would we account for these economic disruptions? Is this too aggressive for to account for those economic disruptions? Is there a middle way? We wanted to get PFM's opinion on this.
Yeah, no, totally understand. I mean, I think that, to me, the decision of what should the policy minimum be is a very different question from how much debt should CVTA issue under a certain scenario. Those to me are two different questions. Like I said, if you look at different entities, and it's not just these regional entities, it's any other, revenue-backed bonds, that just because your policy is 2 times or 10% or whatever it may be, I don't think we're necessarily saying that that is how much we're going to leverage in year 1. So to me, the question of, what is a policy requirement is kind of based on, how much capacity as a whole would be helpful to CVTA in your planning purposes, and for knowing what projects you may or may not have down the pipeline, how much capacity or leveraging power would you like to have within the constraints of, I know that everybody in the board would want to have a high credit rating. So I think it's a balancing between, wanting to have a high credit rating, but also wanting to have capacity. But then I think the question of, okay, we're about to hit a recession, sales tax revenues may, go down substantially, and we need to run sensitivity analysis before we're comfortable issuing X amount of debt, is, I think, a different conversation that we need to have when there are projects or amounts or scenarios that we'd like to look at, because I would not stand here today and say that, CVTA should tomorrow go out and borrow $300 million by any stretch of the imagination.
Any other members? Just a couple of comments. So all good points that were brought up. That's why it's brought up for discussion among the group, and also to get the information out to the community that may be watching. From a policy perspective, I think there are a couple of good recommendations here, especially I think the $17 million recommendation, to build up that fund. And again, to the point that was just made, that just because our policy is that you can issue debt, it doesn't mean that we would issue debt. And the truth of the matter is, we would, I think, hopefully as a body, before we even decided to do that, have you back before us and say, okay, what's the market look like? What do we think is our capabilities here? And is it prudent for us to do it or not to do it? Again, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. But the truth of the matter is, in the future, the makeup of this board might change. And maybe people with differences of opinion who will get on the board and say, you know what, we have not done what the CVTA was intended to do, which is to fund a lot of regional projects, because we haven't issued debt like some of the other regional bodies have, and that's why they are competing more for smart scale dollars. That's why they're competing more for federal dollars, and that's why they're actually accomplishing more in their region. That's just could be a different philosophy that someone else on the board could come up with. But I always think it's great to have these discussions and to make sure that the best information that can be shared with our body is shared with them, so that everybody can think about it and decide what we should do. I do think this will be back before the Finance Committee, certainly to look at some of the recommendations that were made for future discussions on how we can actually work on a reserve and other things. But I know that Mr. Brown is on line, and I'm actually curious what Mr. Brown's thoughts are, because he was actually one of the people who actually worked very hard to get this organization passed.
So thank you, Mr. Carroll and Mr. Chairman. I was listening to the conversation and trying to consider whether I was going to chime in here. I think you guys know the bias and the vision is that the CVTA is about doing big things, right? The things that you as individual jurisdictions could not achieve alone in an efficient manner. And part of that model was the expectation that you'd have the ability to leverage. The way I think about this is, many of us in managing our finances like to have flexibility. And so we may get a home equity line, or we may have a credit card or a line of credit. And we typically go out and get a line that we think we can manage. that's reasonable, but we may not have any current expectation to use that, right? It is there to be able to take advantage of opportunities or necessities as they arise. Setting this policy at the 2.0 level, which I believe is reasonably conservative. I mean, I think the RMTA, and I think Ms. Dean's on, most groups have a coverage ratio of about 1.25, 1.5. A 2.0 coverage ratio is actually fairly conservative in most institutions that I've been involved with. And what it does is it tells you what your capacity can be. But as you said, Mr. Chairman, there's no directive mandate to go and extend that. So to the degree that you're setting a policy, I think the recommendations here are very, very reasonable and sound. And then, of course, this board and future boards will have the ability to determine how much, if any, to access that policy. I don't think that it helps the CVTA to be overly conservative in setting policy when you have the natural check that the board will be able to consider proposals or requests on a case-by-case basis based upon the current environment and temperament. So to the mayor's question, if there's an economic downturn, the board can clearly say we're not going to use this debt capacity. But I would give you the other example of because projects are long lead. We found this with our VDOT projects. The longer it takes to execute a project, the more likely the cost will escalate. So the ability of bringing leverage to the table is that you're able to say, look, we're going to build this in the next 3 years. And that the ability to do that allows you to go out for firm bid contracts and to execute. We do that in my company all the time. And it insulates you from some volatility and interest rate risk that you can't foresee if you had to have a project out there for 7-10 years. So I think having the capacity to do the debt is a very, very strong feature and tool for the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. I didn't mean to put you on the hot seat there, but I respect your opinion, and I figured you probably had one. Any other members? Any other comments? Yes.
Just two mileposts for the authority. On page 23, and Finance Committee had a copy of this when they last met, is a copy of it's actually a red line of the existing financial policies and procedures that the authority has adopted. If you'll look at page 27 of the agenda packet is the marked up regional revenue section that Ms. Choi referenced in her presentation. So this can come back to Finance Committee at its next meeting for discussion.
Yep.
And the other thing I wanted to raise was in previous discussions about taking on debt, I think the comfortable deliberate ramp up period is about 6 months. So once a policy is in place, we can plan on having at least that amount of time to work towards getting things up and running and ready to actually issue the bonds.
Is that right? In other words, if we set a policy today, it would take at least 6 months to put us in position to actually issue bonds, or could we do it quicker? And there's a reason why I'm asking this question.
Yeah, I think that there's a few things that beyond just the scheduling aspect of things that that's coming to my mind is one is just, at some point we're gonna have to put together some legal documents, starting with, what we call a bond indenture that describes like the flow of funds and how debt service is going to be paid, that sort of thing, which would be the authority would need to engage a bond counsel, and that would take some amount of time to develop, being a brand new document. There is also, some offering circulars of preliminary official statements we refer to as POS that we would need to pull together with brand new information. So there's some documentation that I would say that just in and itself would take at least 2 to 3 months for like a working group to brainstorm and have a sound starting point. And beyond that, I'm also thinking about, at the point that the authority is ready to engage with the credit agencies, what's going to be the format of that? Who's going to be engaging in that conversation? Will there be an executive director? These are all the types of things that I'm just thinking in terms of timing, you know, when the appropriate time would be. So I think just, you know, bottom line, I think 6 months is doable. Pushing it shorter, I'm not gonna say it's not doable, but I think it would put some stress on, you know, everybody needing to act quickly and decisions being made quickly about, you know, like bond counsel and all the other steps that need to occur in order to be ready to go out into the market.
Mr. Gregory, you have comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the body. If you recall, approximately 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago, the CVTA issued an RFI, request for information, from bond counsel, outside bond firm, or lawyers at firms that do bond work, and received several responses. If you wanted to engage bond counsel, an RFP would be necessary to put out on the street. And I believe those firms and possibly others would respond to that, but that would be a step that would need to happen. And then they would be directed to develop the indenture and other legal documents necessary. And I believe the PFM would have to create certain documents and get the bond rating process going. So there's several steps that need to happen, but so it may be 6 months. 6 months may be a little aggressive, but it could certainly, if there's an urgency, you can get it going. But those are just some additional steps to keep in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Craig. Well, what I would say is, regardless of what policy we put in place, it never hurts to be prepared. And so that's something I think that I will ask the chair of the Finance Committee to add to our next committee meeting to be discussed, to determine whether or not we can come back to the full body with a recommendation to engage with the bond counsel and these other preliminary steps that would at least position us better, that if the time came that the body decides to change the policy, then we're ahead of the game. There's nothing wrong with being prepared in life. And so, Mr. Chair, I'm going to task you with that for our next meeting, to have something for that.
Thank you. And Mr. Parsons, I will pass on some of that task. Just say, prepare it based on a non-emergency situation, what the time frame would be, that they all, and give us a list of all the steps we need to take.
I mean, it never hurts for us to be, including to be best positioned to move forward, because what I would not want to happen is that, okay, all of a sudden we go, oh man, we need to do this. And then we're behind the 8 ball. If we can be prepared, there's nothing wrong with doing that, to move forward. So, any other members? Yes, sir.
Just a very simple math question, I'm sure it's easy. Your example was 300 million, which would mean 600 million in revenue, correct? I'm not seeing 600 million in the financial statement. What am I missing in terms of annual revenue of 600 million that will allow?
That's a great question. The capacity that's calculated is assuming a 20-year debt service structure. So yes, it's an upfront funding amount that we can get today, given our revenue streams for over a longer period of time.
Good question. Good thing we have a great person to answer it.
I knew it was simple, I just.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I would also recommend that we have 5 jurisdictions represented on the Finance Committee.
Yep.
We have 9 jurisdictions here. I asked all the other jurisdictions, as well as our partners in the Senate and the General Assembly, the legislative delegates, to give us some feedback to help us on the Finance Committee with anything from the stuff we've heard here today. That would be very helpful when we can meet.
Thank you, sir. Anything else, members, on this particular topic? Thank you very much. Before we move forward with the next section, I have been remiss in my duties as chair, because we have new faces in the room, and we've not given them an opportunity to speak, tell us about themselves, and welcome them properly. And one that I see sitting over there is Senator Hashmi, who is our new appointed senator to represent the Senate on the CVTA. You represent the 10th district, if I'm right. So welcome, number one, and number two, would you like to address the body?
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and just delighted to join the CVTA, and I'm taking the position of our now Congresswoman, Jen McClellan, and honored to be on this committee, looking forward to working with the group. And I currently represent the 10th Senatorial District. With redistricting, of course, things are changing, and it will be the 15th Senatorial District that I am currently running in, and hope to continue to serve in the General Assembly. But I look forward to working with the members here and offering feedback as you requested, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I see another relatively new face, sir.
Yeah, I was just discussing with my colleague, I probably should learn to keep my mouth shut.
No.
No, my name is Zach Trogdon. I'm relatively new with the Department of Rail and Public Transportation. I used to work in a region in Charles City County with Mr. Cota, who's online. So it's great to see some familiar faces and be back working for this region as well as the whole state.
Thank you. Now I feel better. Sorry about that. I apologize again. Sometimes you get, we were worrying if we were gonna get a quorum. We got a quorum. We got kind of rushed into the thing, and I'm like, that was not nice. So that's better. Next.
Okay. CVTA,
Yep.
I believe, is next item.
Yep, Tech Advisory Committee. Awesome. She's like, oh, it's me?
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, members of the authority. Dyrona Moore Clark here. I am the CVTA TAC Chair, and I will be giving a brief update on the items discussed at our last TAC meeting held on April the 10th, 2023. This will be short, as TAC has many agenda items for your consideration today that I and help from some of my members or co-chair are here will be speaking to. For the Fall Line Trail update, the Fall Line Working Group has reviewed the proposals and have made a recommendation for awarding the wayfinding contract. This consultant will help with seamless implementation along the corridor. TAC is in its final steps to provide this body with its recommendations for changes to the regional project selection and allocation framework, and this is an action today. So with that, I will move right into our main agenda item, which is the project selection and allocation framework review that has been undertaken by TAC and is being presented today for action. I will bring your attention that we are referring to this framework document that is in your packet and also on the screen. And I will start with the first major change, told many times before, CVTA regional funding cycles will be on alternate years opposite of smart scale. And again, this is to coincide with non-smart scale years. On alternating years, funding requests for existing projects will be considered. Clarified that an approved funding scenario is needed in advance of smart scale pre-application start date. And I'm gonna quickly ask Barb, you helped me last time with the page numbers. So I think I'm speaking to page 2.
Yes, page 2 of the document.
Awesome. So again, page 2 in your packet, speaking to the
It's page 35 in the packet. Page
35 in the
2
packet, yes, thank you.
in your section.
And you can see that red line version of those changes that I just spoke of. Yep, so page 3, which is then 36 in your packet, we talk about the project categories and eligibility. The highway project category now allows for every applicant to submit one priority highway project outside of the criteria, which is outside of the functional class and the volume threshold. So that is one of our greatest accomplishments that TAC was able to work through. This is really our attempt at inclusivity of both our rural and our urban areas to really take advantage of the impact that CVTA regional funds can have on a locality and its economic development and its, prosperity when it comes to transportation projects being that driver. So we're excited about that. We, on a more technical side, we eliminated the 20 million total project estimate for PE only requests. Currently in our structure, it allows for PE only requests. And as we begin to look at some of our smart scale outcomes of how we scored, we do think that it would be an advantage to allow for some 30% preliminary engineering design to occur, not on a capped amount, but to occur that may help give better estimates and take away some of the cost overruns that we've seen over some of our other regional funding sources and programming. So we're really being proactive in trying to ensure that our projects come into fruition. So again, allowing for those PE only requests to not be capped. The next section is the project screening. Again, in an attempt to ensure that we are utilizing the funds, that we are not overspending or underestimating, we have put in for approval that an applicant estimate has to be submitted using VDOT cost estimating workbook. So that is a way for all of our numbers from those VDOT administered projects as well as the locality administered projects for us to have in order for those to be comparable when we're looking at funding those projects, or are the estimates correct? The applicant's estimates and the third-party estimates will be reviewed by TAC, with TAC making a final recommendation to the full authority. Again, that's some of the technicality when we are looking at cost and who reviews those costs and who's administering the project. So we thought that putting it in the selection framework that this would occur would be an important step. The next major was the project scoring and ranking. There we state that scores will be evaluated to determine the impact of outliers on the normalized scores and may be adjusted to better compare benefits. Again, just some of the projects that are skewed, just really normalizing those when we're comparing it for the prioritization process. Next major change is the project selection. Here, we did two major changes, which was remove that at least one project should be selected from each of the 7 project categories, as well as removes that at least one project should be geographically located in each of the 9 member jurisdictions. With this, TAC believe that we should not be limiting or restricting projects and what the authority will be selecting. So if the authority wants to ensure that every category a project is there, or that it's located in every jurisdiction, that is of the authority to make that decision and not to be done at the TAC level. So that is what we intended there. We also wanted to open up and clarify for when an application is submitted for leveraging as well as for PE. So in this past cycle, when it was submitted, if you had a project that you wanted the full amount for, as well as you submitted under the PE criteria, then what happened was if it got completely funded, it was not considered for the 30%. So we would like for, when those requests come in for the same project, that both funding requests need to be considered independent of the other. So we wanted to have that clear. And you will see that a good example of that as we move to the next agenda item, where we talk about localities that have leveraging funds requesting to do 30% preliminary engineering. In some cases, localities, they had applied, it didn't score well in smart scale, but they had applied for the preliminary engineering only, but it wasn't considered because the whole project got funded or leveraged, but then when it got to smart scale, it didn't do well. So now we're that locality, they're coming back and saying, well, can I at least do the 30% to better my chances to go to smart scale? So you'll see that connection as we move through these agenda items and the importance of having cost estimates and preliminary engineering to give you better estimates as well as improve your likelihood of receiving additional federal or state funds. So that takes us right into the leveraging funds. So for the leveraging funds, it was originally in our project framework that the applicant could keep the approved leveraging funds for 2 cycles. This was again concurred by TAC members that keeping this leveraging for 2 cycles allows for the leveraging of those funds for IIJA at the federal level and or other state programs outside of smart scale. So we didn't want to solely say you don't make smart scale, you haven't leveraged well. We really want to get people to get other sources to leverage with the CVTA, whether that's federal or some other state sources outside of smart scale. Again, we changed that if a new leveraging amount, so this again is specifically related to state projects that were given money to leverage in smart scale and it didn't score well or didn't make the cut. How, and this project is important to a locality, how do we still allow them that ability to try and complete the project by leveraging? So with that, we are saying that if a new leveraging amount is requested and approved, the use of the leveraging will be considered the first attempt. So Barb can probably explain some of our why we decided on putting it in that language.
Yes, so you'll remember that the information that Miles Bushing presented to the TPO and also to this body, showing that if additional money besides what was leveraged, if we added $5 million more to a project, let's say, it may have been successful in the last round of smart scale. So what we're saying here is a locality can request a new leveraging amount, and that leveraging attempt would be the first cycle in round 6. We just finished with round 5. So that would mean the locality could keep that new amount. Let's say it went from 20 to 25. They would be able to try to get additional funding for that project for 2 attempts.
Thank you, Barb. We also wanted to clarify that if the sponsor, they can request a portion of leveraging funds in the amount necessary to develop 30% plans, which will reduce the leveraging accordingly. So again, as you'll see later in the agenda, on the programming request, those requested amounts to use, say Richmond has 27 million for the Fall Line Commerce Road, we're requesting $1 million to do preliminary engineering, and therefore our remaining leveraging amount is 26 million. So that is what that says, that you don't get to do PE and maintain your original leveraging dollar amount. So that's what we wanted to clarify there. With that, I think that I've touched on mainly all of our parking lot items and review items. This was put before the TAC and passed unanimously. This morning I'm off. The rain is doing it, but
that's what I would say.
So it also went to Finance Committee and they also recommended for this body's approval. And that is what we're asking today, as our application cycle is set to open around September. We would appreciate that this document be approved as our guidelines and framework for selecting the next set of CVTA regional projects.
All right, any member comments? Mr. Spinner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have one of my many mantras is iterate to great. And I think this is an amazing reiteration getting us to great. And I'm very thankful for the TAC. I do spend time reviewing the meetings, and the work you guys do is really admirable. And I'm in favor of almost everything you've suggested. I just did have a question on page 44, in talking, obviously, cost overruns have been an issue. I do see that TAC is recommending striking funding swap, which do not negatively impact project schedules, and I'm just curious of the rationale behind that.
Yeah, I think we're thinking, sorry.
Yeah.
But funding swap was one of the things, first, we didn't like the word funding swap. So I know that was the beginning of why we striked it.
Let me just read this section.
Yeah.
Let me try to refresh my memory.
And I think it was resolved with the leveraging section.
Because the way I read this is, say, Goshen County had 2 projects, and there was funding on both of them, and somehow Project A needed money to move over to it from Project B, and it wasn't gonna impact Project B because we had other funds coming in, we'd be able to do that. So I'm hoping this doesn't take away from our flexibility.
Well, that is a big point of discussion with the TAC, was that the money that's allocated to the projects is project specific and not specific to a locality. So, a locality could make that request, certainly, through the authority, but we didn't want to have that as a written policy. And I'm still trying to get my head around that deletion.
Well, whether it's deleted or not, the locality still would have the opportunity to come back before the CVTA to ask for the same consideration like y'all did.
Yes, and Mr. Spoonhauer, just above that, it says CVTA staff may consider the use of balance entry or funding swaps which do not negatively impact the project schedules to address overruns. So again.
So is that, maybe it was just redundant there?
Exactly.
So that's a great idea. So we're removing redundancy, making it a leaner document. Love it. Sorry,
I had to read fast.
Any other member comments?
Mr. Chair, this is a recommendation from the Finance Committee for, so this motion is on the floor.
Motion is on the floor. That's why we opened it for discussion. Not seeing any other discussion. All those in favor of the changes, signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes carried. Next item.
Thank you, yay, TAC.
I say yay, TAC, absolutely.
Don't have too much fun on that.
I do have more items for your consideration. We also I spoke on it earlier about the advanced funding for preliminary engineering. So in your package, you have a programming request to advance preliminary engineering up to 30% plans. This document.
Page 49.
49. And again, now in line with our newly approved plan, we state a framework that there would be consideration for up to 30% of leverage funds, again, to improve that project's ability to be leveraged for federal funding or other state funding. And with that, we have 2 Richmond projects on the list, as well as 2 Chesterfield projects that are requesting preliminary engineering. Again, this would reduce the leveraging amount by the request amount. And so out of the total amount, again, Richmond had 1 million requests out of its 27 million. Chesterfield, 750,000 for its I-95 Route 10 interchange Phase 2 project. The Route 360 is requesting 750,000, and the 800,000 for our Richmond's Forest Hill project. And again, the SPA for these dollar amounts will come before the Finance Committee and the full body. This is just granting us that permission to allow for these projects on this list highlighted in yellow to approve that request. And again, final approval and moving or spending of any dollars will come back before you in the form of a SPA. Again, we ask for the approval for Richmond and Chesterfield to have advanced preliminary engineering request approved.
Mr. Peterson.
Chair, the Finance Committee has reviewed this request and recommended approval.
All right, any discussion? Motion is on the floor. Any discussion? Not seeing any discussion, all those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes carried. I'll just make one comment on that. This does set a precedent, I would say, that for any other locality that has a project that they've submitted, if they think that coming before the body now to request P&E, you should consider it. Because when we do this, it structures those projects in a better position to actually score better at smart scale. So that's something that whether you're all the localities, I would recommend that you go back to your staffs and take a look at it. Next item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next up are locality spas. This is a very exciting day. These are our standard project agreements between the CVTA and localities. The two localities up today that are requesting the approval and signature of the chair on the spas are Chesterfield and Henrico. In your packet, about the last 41 pages are those documents and those agreements. Again, they are in line with the regional funding project allocations that were approved. And also for fall line trail segments are also in there. So again, we are moving along with the fall line trail in Henrico, and we are moving our regional projects in Chesterfield with these agreements. They have been reviewed by each locality's attorneys and I think approved by the governing body of both Henrico and Chesterfield. And we're requesting, again, your approval for the chair to sign these SPA agreements so that they can begin spending regional funds.
Mr. Chair, a little clarification.
Yes, sir.
The first part, 50 through 79, are the Chesterfield County requests. They're all included as individual agreements. And at the top of each agreement section is the project name, the EPC, and the project ID. I did want to clarify that staff incorrectly packaged the Henrico request starting on page 80. Henrico has asked that these are all fall line trail segments, and the county has asked that they be taken as one item. All 7 projects are listed at the top of page 80. So we were redundant in our developing the agenda package, and I would like to ask that this be considered as one package of 7 segments.
Sure.
And legal counsel, Gregory, do you have recommendations on how to proceed with the vote?
Yes, sir. One at a time. Take each SPA one at a time, please, and consider them and be a roll call vote, please.
Okay. Bring it forward one at a time, Mr. Parker.
Yes, sir. The first item,
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
if you would, I'm just curious, I wish I was more to understanding on what this vote signifies. So the SPA group, so we've already agreed as a body to fund these projects. What does this vote do or not do? I'm sorry if I'm being too elementary.
No. Well,
yes, sir. This, if I can.
go ahead. I was gonna let you do it.
Each individual agreement sets in place the mechanism for the project to move forward as a locality administered project using CVTA funds. With the appendices that are included each one, it includes the details for each project and the anticipated date of each milestone. It also sets in place the reimbursement process so that as the locality moves forward with the project and milestones are met, those reimbursements requests can be sent directly to the CVTA to process and consider. And it basically sets in place the legal framework for how that project can move forward.
Simplistic definition is it's a contract between the locality and the CVTA and what requirements the locality needs to meet if they're accepting the funds.
That's correct.
That's the simplest term, thank you. Less word.
Great, great.
And if I could, the agreements, I think were before the body at the last meeting. They just weren't specified to a locality. And the locality has now filled out the information, and with the project ID that the CVTA provided, along with, the signatures of their governing body approving the document. And so again, today, we're asking for the chair's signature and, sealing this, agreement of how the CVTA regional dollars will be treated, reimbursed, and, processed, as a new funding for the locality.
So, again, it may be something for a different meeting, but procedurally, I'm just thinking, so we've already approved these, now we're coming back, so we have to reapprove every project that we say goes forward.
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
What you've approved to date is
The
a
language.
template document, okay? So the SPA that you saw before was basically a template, a form that you approved that in theory would govern locality administered projects when they were proposed for funding to the authority, so that everybody was comfortable with the terms. How are these projects gonna be governed? What are gonna be the roles and responsibilities of the locality administering the project and the CVTA for distribution of funds, right? So now we have, and it's not a theory anymore, we have actual projects. We have the Fall Line Trail, we have these specific locally administered projects that are before you today, that the member localities are asking to be funded. So this is the first, essentially the first round of real funding that the SPA will be issuing, that the CVTA will be issuing for regional projects. So that's, these contracts will govern those projects going forward as far as funding goes. Now it will be up to each locality administering those projects to comply with those terms, administer those projects, and then come back and submit the reports and other documentation necessary for the CVTA to make sure that there's compliance with those agreements. So you'll be hearing about these projects again, hopefully in very positive light, and we'll see how they go. But these projects are unique because most of the smaller localities, when they want to have projects done, regionally funded projects done in their communities, those will more likely than not be administered by VDOT.
That's the distinction.
Yes, okay, so that's the difference.
There you
So Henrico, Chesterfield, City of Richmond, and to some extent Hanover have the capability to self-administer projects, right? We have, for the VDOT administered projects that will occur in, any of the jurisdictions, but most likely the smaller jurisdictions, we have the Form SPA, which is a much larger document. That's an exhibit to the big agreement that CVTA has with VDOT, right? So those projects, can come forward also at any time. But that agreement's gonna be a more robust agreement, larger agreement, and VDOT will be coming along hand in hand with the smaller jurisdictions typically with a contract for those projects. But these are just for Henrico to administer their portions of the Fall Line Trail, for the City of Richmond to administer these projects within their jurisdiction, and then Chesterfield likewise. So that's where we are. Are there any questions about that or any concerns? Okay, these have been vetted by the form documents, just so you know, have been vetted by your respective local legal counsel. They've been vetted through the TAC, and they've been vetted through the Finance Committee. So each of those individuals or entities have reviewed these draft documents in several iterations, and we're iterating to great, and now we're there at the point where they can now be approved. Yes, sir.
What? Parsons.
Yeah, so we have, in order to do this, as I mentioned, you're gonna take each SPA individually, okay? And there's gonna be a roll call vote to
Except for
approve.
Henricos, they're all gonna be a quarter to one.
Well, yeah, because that's one master
One.
SPA
That's
with
right.
individual pieces.
That's right.
So there's a resolution that we prepared ahead of time, and let's just take the first one, very slowly, okay?
Sure.
So, the resolution would be in this form. It is hereby resolved that the CVTA approves the standard project administration agreement for the CVTA regionally funded project described as the Fall Line, I'm sorry, we're gonna do the Woolridge Road, project first. Described as the Woolridge Road Route 288 Old Hundred Road Extension, UPC number 112974, as submitted, and authorizes the chair to execute the agreement and any other documents or instruments necessary to properly administer the agreement and the projects described therein. It is further resolved that the project funds for the CVTA project, ID number CVTA 0, project ID number 0038 are hereby set forth in the agreement in the total amount of, bear with me here, $750,000 are hereby allocated and appropriated for purposes of project execution, subject to review and approval in accordance with CVTA policies and procedures. It is further resolved that CVTA staff are authorized and directed to execute and administer the agreement and the projects described therein in compliance with the terms of the agreement and all applicable laws, regulations, and policies of the CVTA.
As you can see, this is pretty complex.
I made a mistake. Hold on.
Told you.
Okay, yeah, I skipped ahead, I'm sorry. Correction, the project, the total amount of the project is $37,578,116. A little different.
That's a big difference. All right, so we need that in form of a motion.
Move for approval, Mr. Chair.
All right, you accept making that motion? Ms. Peterson?
I'm making that motion.
You've made that motion, it's been seconded by the mayor. Thank you all, making that simple. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed?
I thought this was roll call.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're absolutely
Yeah,
right.
I'm sorry.
I stand corrected, roll call vote.
Thank you.
Mr. Hodges?
Aye.
Mr. Coda?
Aye.
Chair Carroll?
Aye.
Mr. Spoonhour?
Aye.
Mr. Peterson?
Aye.
Mr. Thornton?
Aye.
Ms. Page?
May
Mayor
not be on there.
Stoney?
Aye.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Byerly?
Aye.
Senator Hashmi?
Aye.
Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Thank you, that motion carries.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, for catching that.
Next.
Next.
Okay. It's hereby resolved that the CVTA approves the standard project administration agreement for the CVTA regionally funded project described as I-95 Route 10 Interchange Improvement Phase 2, CVTA project ID 0034. As submitted, and authorize the chair to execute the agreement and any other documents or instruments necessary to properly administer the agreement and the projects described therein. It's further resolved that project funds for the CVTA project ID numbers set forth in the agreement 0034 in the total amount of $750,000 are hereby allocated and appropriated for purposes of project execution, subject to review and approval in accordance with CVTA policies and procedures. It's further resolved that CVTA staff are authorized and directed to execute and administer the agreement and the projects described therein in compliance with the terms of the agreement and all applicable laws, regulations, and policies of the CVTA.
So moved.
Motion is made by the mayor.
Second.
Second by Mr. Spoonhour. Any discussion on the motion? Not seeing any discussion, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Hodges?
Aye.
Mr. Coda?
Aye.
Chair Carroll?
Aye.
Mr. Spoonhour?
Aye.
Mr. Peterson?
Aye.
Mr. Thornton?
Aye.
Mr. Byerly?
Aye.
Mayor Stoney?
Aye.
Senator Hashmi?
Aye.
And Mr. Brown?
Aye.
That motion carries.
Next, it is hereby resolved that the CVTA approves the standard project administration agreement for the CVTA regionally funded project described as Route 288 northbound flyover to Bailey Bridge Connector, CVTA project ID number 0025, as submitted, and authorize the chair to execute the agreement and any other documents or instruments necessary to properly administer the agreement and the projects described therein. It is further resolved that project funds for CVTA project number 0025 set forth in the agreement in the total amount of $3,696,750 are hereby allocated and appropriated for purposes of project execution, subject to review and approval in accordance with CVTA policies and procedures. It is further resolved that CVTA staff are authorized and directed to execute and administer the agreement and the projects described therein in compliance with the terms of the agreement and all applicable laws, regulations, and policies of the CVTA.
Move for approval.
Second. I have a motion by Mr. Peterson, seconded by Mr. Hodges. Any discussion on the motion? Not seeing any discussion on the motion, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Hodges?
Aye.
Mr. Coda?
Aye.
Chair Carroll?
Aye.
Mr. Spoonhour?
Aye.
Mr. Peterson?
Aye.
Mr. Thornton?
Aye.
Mr. Byerly?
Aye.
Mayor Stoney?
Aye.
Senator Hashmi?
Aye.
And Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries.
It is hereby resolved that the CVTA approves the standard project administration agreement for the CVTA regionally funded project described as Route 360, Wood Lake Parkway to Otterdale Road widening. CVTA project ID number 0042 as submitted, and authorize the chair to execute the agreement and any other documents or instruments necessary to properly administer the agreement and the projects described therein. It is further resolved that project funds for the CVTA project ID number 0042 set forth in the agreement in the total amount of $750,000 are hereby allocated and appropriated for purposes of project execution, subject to review and approval in accordance with CVTA policies and procedures. It is further resolved that CVTA staff are authorized and directed to execute and administer the agreement and the projects described therein in compliance with the terms of the agreement and all applicable laws, regulations, and policies of the CVTA.
Motion. Made by Mr. Thornton.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Peterson. Any discussion on the motion? Let's see here, any discussion, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Hodges?
Aye.
Mr. Coda?
Aye.
Chair Carroll?
Aye.
Mr. Spoonhour?
Aye.
Mr. Peterson?
Aye.
Mr. Thornton?
Two more.
Mr. Byerly?
Aye.
Mayor Stoney?
Aye.
Senator Hashmi? Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Next, we're getting close, two more.
It is hereby resolved that the CVTA approves the standard project administration agreement for the CVTA regionally funded project described as Chippenham Parkway, Route 60 interchange improvements, also known as CVTA project ID number 0027, as submitted, and authorize the chair to execute the agreement and any other documents or instruments necessary to properly administer the agreement and the projects described therein. It is further resolved that project funds for the CVTA project ID 0027 set forth in the agreement in the total amount of $2 million are hereby allocated and appropriated for purposes of project execution, subject to review and approval in accordance with CVTA policies and procedures. It is further resolved that CVTA staff are authorized and directed to execute and administer the agreement and the projects described therein in compliance with the terms of the agreement and all applicable laws, regulations, and policies of the CVTA.
Move for approval.
Motion is made, do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Thornton. Let's see, any discussion on the motion? Not seeing any, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Hodges?
Aye.
Mr. Coda?
Aye.
Chair Carroll?
Aye.
Mr. Spoonhour?
Aye.
Mr. Peterson?
Aye.
Mr. Thornton?
Aye.
Mr. Byerly?
Aye.
Mayor Stoney?
Aye.
Senator Hashmi? Mr. Brown?
Aye.
The motion carries.
Thank you, next item, which should be a bunch of them, all in one.
Yes, sir. It is hereby resolved, and bear with me, it is hereby resolved that the CVTA approves the standard project administration agreement for the CVTA regionally funded project described as the Fall Line Trail, CVTA project ID number 0008, 0009, 0010, 0011, 0012, 0013, and 0014 as submitted, and authorize the chair to execute the agreement and any other documents or instruments necessary to properly administer the agreements and the projects described therein. It is further resolved that project funds for the CVTA project ID numbers set forth in the agreement in the total amount, I do not have the total amount. So I can read each one.
Check. Hard-handed.
Do the math.
That's good. Right here.
The total amount of $35,819,905 are hereby allocated and appropriated for purposes of project execution, subject to review and approval in accordance with CVTA policies and procedures. It is further resolved that CVTA staff are authorized and directed to execute and administer the agreement and the projects described therein in compliance with the terms of the agreement and all applicable laws, regulations, and policies of the CVTA.
Since this is such a historical occasion, and I really do think it is for these agreements to be signed, I would like to at least get to make a motion to approve one of them, so I'm making a motion to approve this project.
Second.
Motion's made. Any discussion on the motion? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Hyman.
Aye.
Mr. Coda.
Aye.
Chair Carroll.
Aye.
Mr. Spoonhour.
Aye.
Mr. Peterson.
Aye.
Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
Mr. Byerly.
Aye.
Mayor Stoney.
Aye.
Senator Hashmi. Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, we are on to the CVTA wayfinding plan.
Mr. Chair, thank you for this item. We are requesting, based on the recommendation of the Fall Line Working Group, that we enter into contract negotiations with the selected consultant for the wayfinding RFP that we put out. After looking at the firm's experiences, team management, project approach, and timeframe, we did make a selection, but I will hand it off to Chet, because I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say who we selected or not, so I'll pass it over.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. A little background, CVTA authorized the issuance of an RFP to develop a wayfinding plan for the Fall Line. We received 7 qualified proposals, and the Fall Line Work Group, as Ms. Clark just noticed, took the initiative to review the proposals and score according to a set of criteria that were included in the RFP. The recommendation from the Fall Line Working Group is to select AB Design as the firm to enter into contract negotiations with, and are now asking for approval from the full authority to move forward and have staff initiate that process.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. Hodges.
thank you. I didn't see any materials in the packet, and all I don't oppose. I see it's before us, and I need to read it. It's just uncomfortable to be shown something and not have a chance to read it. And I have no problems probably with the recommendation, but I'm uncomfortable voting without having a chance to read it.
Is there a reason why it wasn't included in the packet?
Well, Mr. Chair, what was included in the packet was a link. We apologize, it wasn't paper, but it was a link to the RFP, and that's what's shown on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what describes the contents of the wayfinding plan and what the proposals were supposed to include.
I missed that point, that it's linked.
I apologize for the
No,
confusion.
it's my omission, and so I think it's been properly presented to us, and I would remove my concerns, even though I'm not had an opportunity to read it. I may abstain.
Anybody else?
Mr. Chairman, may I bring up another issue? with this?
Yes.
I don't know whether or not we've ever discussed this as a board, but, do we have any type of, impetus to making sure that as these work people, that minority groups are included?
I would hope that we actually have discussed this before.
Yes, sir.
That we wanted to make sure that when these RFPs were put out, that we were putting out to all diverse groups to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to bid on these projects. And now I would defer to staff to find out who they actually sent it to, but I know that we have discussed this when you were chair to make sure that we were equitable in who we actually sent any RFP out to. Am I correct in that?
Yes, sir, and you can see the heading on the RFP is Plan RVA, and as part of the review of all of our internal guidance documents, the procurement policy was updated previously to reflect the desire to include disenfranchised communities and firms, and this was all done at the same time that our Title VI policy was updated and our outreach engagement procedure.
Mr. Chair, I think we established a very broad area of number of places that we were gonna actually advertise in the past.
Yep.
To make sure that everybody had an opportunity to be aware of this. Did we advertise in all those places?
Yes, sir. Yes, we did.
Good. Any other discussion? All right, do I have a motion?
So moved.
Motion to approve, do I have a second? Second, by Mr. Thornton. Since this is an expenditure, is there any other discussion on this? If not, we will have a roll call vote.
Mr. Hodges?
Abstain.
Mr. Coda?
Aye.
Chair Carroll?
Aye.
Mr. Spoonhour?
Aye.
Mr. Peterson?
Aye.
Mr. Thornton?
Aye.
Mr. Byerly?
Aye.
Mayor Stoney?
Aye.
Senator Hashmi?
Aye.
Mr. Brown?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Just to clarify, that this is really just authorizing Plan RVA to enter into negotiations to actually hire this company to provide this. So there is, and then it will come back before the body for full authorization. So Mr. Hodges' point, the link is there. You have an opportunity to review it. If you have any questions or comments about what's actually in the proposal, contact staff to make any adjustments. And then it'll be back before us for a final ratification of any contract once it's brought forward. Am I correct on that? Yes, sir. All right, that's been a lot of business this morning, I have to tell you. A lot of great things accomplished today. Moving into our last section of the other business, when I was honored to be your chair, the selection committee that made that recommendation also had a recommendation about putting in place, or at least reviewing or giving us an opportunity to put in place a rotation similar to what we use for Plan RVA and leadership and the TPO and leadership. And I had asked Mr. Hodges to work with me and draft a proposed rotation that could happen. Now, we all know that certainly the way things are right now, that established by code and by our bylaws, that we as we did for the last 3 years, we would establish a committee that would nominate people for not just chair, vice chair, but also for the other two positions in the finance committee. And trying to, and certainly that has worked. I'm not gonna sit here and say it hasn't. Obviously, we functioned very well for the last couple of years. But it always comes down to where we, quite frankly, have to task that committee, and then also, quite frankly, find out who's interested in being in leadership and who's not interested in being in leadership. And with the rotation, if it was established, we would have a clear path for that. But the CVTA would still maintain the flexibility, for example, to say, whatever jurisdiction would be next up, if that leadership in that board of supervisors or city council changes, or if the mayor's position changes and someone else gets put in there and they are now tasked with being the chair, they would have the opportunity to say, I know we're up, but I don't have I'm not familiar enough with it right now to actually take on role of chair. I mean, and that has happened with us in other organizations that we've seen regionally, but I wanted to bring it up for a discussion to get input from the members on how they would feel about this, or if they're fine with the way we're doing it. But I think that it kind of spells out expectations over time, who would be next up for a jurisdiction to be in rotation. And I think it, quite frankly, adds for some opportunities for some of the smaller jurisdictions to have leadership roles. So I'm going to open that up for discussion. Mr. Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In preparing this and potentially being a member of the nominating committee for next year, it's pretty clear that Richmond and the mayor will be recommended for chairmanship next year. But there was a question for the vice chair, and the committee, which Dr. Newbell and Mr. Byerly participated in. And I quickly add, Mr. Byerly has nothing to do with this rotation, but it's one that arguably is guidance and can be adjusted as the chair suggests. In our last discussion, I think Mr. Peterson suggested the finance committee recognize there be some continuity so that New Kent, for example, could go in, that there be overlap rather than a complete change in the smaller localities. But in any case, it helps to have guidance, and it's clear on what's happening next year with the chair, but we need guidance on the vice chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Thornton, do you have a comment?
Mr. Chairman, I recall when we began the momentous challenge that we had and how we've done thus far. I think that in the long run, as I look at this august organization, that it probably would be efficacious and prudent if there was opportunity for a smaller locality to be chair. And I say that after I had become the chair of the opportunity that we had at that point in time. So I would not be against the smaller localities participating. I tend to think that this August organization can always change some of its policy. But, as a region now, I'm thinking that regions gonna have to be competitive. And hopefully, I know that around this table, we have some of the best leadership. And so my prediction is that will continue in the future because people will choose which competitive districts they will come to. And so I think it's just maybe incumbent upon us to kind of make sure that we are inclusive. And that's my feeling about that.
Thank you, Mr. Thornton. Anybody else? I'll add this comment. First of all, I think since this organization started, with the members that we've had, and we've had some rotate in and out. And under Frank's leadership for 2 years especially, we've worked very well together as an organization. I think there have been great friendships and relationships that have been built because of that. But things change. And so we could put a policy like this in place, and then other people could get on this board and say, yeah, we don't like that. We're gonna change it to something else. And they have the right to do it if they're in the leadership of that role. But with the way we've all worked together very well, and I think there was only really, truthfully, one contentious vote in the last 3 years. And it was actually a vote that everybody ended up on the same side of in the end, which was to approve the regional transportation package. We got to the same end. It just took us a couple of times to get there. But in the entire time that I've been here, I think everybody's been fantastic to work together with, quite frankly. And so could we stay the where we are and still be fine? Yes, but if it changes, technically you could get someone else. I'll use Chesterfield as an example. You could get someone else from Chesterfield come in and say, well, you know what, I don't care what the rotation says, I want to be leader. And then we know that we have weighted voting in here and that could change that. Or you may get different personalities that come forward next time that are less likely to want to work together as well as we have regionally. Which is why I think I'm in favor of this, to give other localities at least an opportunity. And then if they don't want to do it, they turn around and say, I'm not ready for that, or I don't need that. We can always have, this is only a policy, if I'm correct, it's not a bylaws change.
Right.
And it's something that can literally be changed later by incoming people, or even by this, if everybody stays the same, they can turn around and say, you know what, we want to change it back to what we did before. So that's why I thought it was a worthy discussion when it was recommended by the nominating committee last time, and I made the commitment to bring it forward to the full body. Yes.
Just to highlight some of your comments, I would say that that's the whole reason why the document is described as it is. It's a non-binding governance guidance document, number one. It's not a binding policy, it's not a regulation, it's a guideline, it's a guidance document that provides a framework for the body. You can choose to be guided by it, or you can choose to depart from it as you see fit, but at least it provides a framework for you to look at and reference. And you can say, well, this is what the framework provides for, this is what the rotation provides for, but for whatever reason or no reason at all, we're going to depart from that at this time and elect so-and-so to be the chair or vice chair or member of the finance committee or whatever. So it's exactly as the chairman described. It's a guidance document and a framework, but not a binding policy. And I will also note that in the fourth line of the cover page, the language of the policy, it uses the word may be rotated. So it's not a shall. So that's all I'll offer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Peterson.
Mr. Chair, I think it's important to realize that size of a jurisdiction has nothing to do with leadership. Leadership is an individual quality, and that can be found in every one of our jurisdictions. But there's larger jurisdictions do have the ability to bring a lot more things to the table in terms of the staffing and what have you. But that, I think, is covered in the fact that by the legislation that formed the CVTA, that the city, Chesterfield, and Henrico will always be represented on the finance committee. So that allows, never takes that out of the equation, the assets we have there. So I don't have a problem with this at all. I would like for us to be able to take advantage of the leadership wherever it may fall. But I do go back to the thing that was mentioned earlier with Mr. Hodges, that on the finance committee, the two seats that are not mandated from the city of Chesterfield and Henrico, I don't think we ought to be changing both of them out every year. We ought to just have at least a 2-year term for each of the small jurisdictions, so we have that continuity. You come in there cold, and after the first year, you're gonna be effective, but for the first few months is tough. So I would suggest, for instance, right, just looking at this, I would adjust it so that I'd move Powhatan down to where Town of Ashland is and keep Lucan in there. This page is on there right now. It would be her second term if we were to go with this. And then Powhatan would do the same thing and on to each continuity.
Okay. Anybody else?
Mr. Chairman, I'll just add, and I have to go, I have an 11:15. I do like the suggestions from Mr. Peterson, but I will admit that I do remain unconvinced that we need a rotation for the leadership roles of the entire authority. I do believe that the smaller localities have room to participate in the electoral, the democratic process that is already laid out in the bylaws of this authority. And just like the contentious vote that, well, what we call contentious, because I don't think we come from contentious backgrounds on our fellow boards of supervisors or city councils or things of that nature. These are decisions that are made within the body, that are come to an agreement either here or outside of the meeting room. That's how I think we got the leaders that we have in the current places they are today. Whether it's on the finance committee, whether it's the leadership here, these are individuals who spoke to one another. What do you think about this? How do you think about that? And we came to an agreement. And I think that sort of dialogue is good for bodies like this as a region, because it shows that we can actually collaborate and come to an agreement on the leaders who actually lead these authorities that come with a lot of, power and responsibility. And so I remain unconvinced that I can vote for something like this. Doesn't mean that I can't be convinced, but I haven't seen any compelling reason yet to fix something which they would say ain't broke.
Good. Anybody else? Well, this is up for discussion. Does not necessarily require action today. I will say that the time is getting short for, we have to be prepared for who's gonna take over and chair in July. And so if we don't take any action on this between now and then, as a precautionary measure, I'm gonna ask some people to serve on a nominating committee. So we will have, we'll be prepared in both means. When the time comes, we'll get a recommendation from a nominating committee, they can bring it forward. And then we can have a discussion then on both this item and any recommendations from the nominating committee. You'll see on the number 2, under other business, that will be reserved in the future for agency updates. I think I spoke to it at the last meeting that we would like to have that, and so we don't have one this month, which is good because we ran really long today. Anybody else have any CVTA member comments? Go to the order. I will say that I have been in contact with the organization that has been contracted to find us an executive director, and I continue to have contact with them and speak with them, and both verbally and through email. And some of you may have gotten calls from them as well, and they are making progress. And so that's it. If not, anything else?
Just next meeting is the joint meeting on June 1st. And you all should be getting information about that if you have not already. And then following that, the first organizational meeting for FY24 will be July 14th. So the middle of the month to account for the spacing of the next couple meetings.
And I will say that, just to cover my bases, that there will be a formal announcement on who the nominating committee will be. We will send that out in a notification, both to the members and to the community as necessary to meet the statute. Anything else? If not, then I will accept the motion to adjourn.
So move.
Motion's made and second. All those in favor? Aye.